This episode is brought to you by the House of Chanel.
Join us for Chanel Connects, the Venice Biennale edition. We've taken up residence in Italy to introduce you to the artists, curators, thinkers, and makers behind the world's most important exhibition of contemporary art. Guests include actress Vicky Krieps.
I've been trying to push myself to a place where I let go.
Artist Julien Creuset.
My studio looked like a secret kitchen.
And renowned gallerist Sadie Coles.
The main thing is to keep your ears open.
Listen to Chanel Connects on Chanel.com or wherever you get your podcasts.
That defiance, that edge of proving something against a bias, against this work, that's what excited me most in those critics. Well, fine art doesn't have that.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. As a novelist, Jonathan Lethem is basically a genre all his own. His books mashing up literary fiction and pulp into disorienting but engaging combinations. Since the success of Motherless Brooklyn in 1999, he's published many very well-received novels, including The Fortress of Solitude and, most recently, Brooklyn crime novel, as well as many more short stories and essays. And it turns out he's written a lot about art too, enough to fill an entire book. Cellophane Bricks, A Life in Visual Culture, which was published this summer, is its own type of unexpected hybrid of writing. It unites Lethem's very personal reflections on growing up around artists in Brooklyn, eerie short stories that originated as experimental catalog essays for artists including Nan Goldin, Jim Shaw, and Gregory Crewdson, and essays on artists he's discovered, artworks he lives with, and maybe, most importantly, his ideas about the relationship between literature and art and what the real value of creativity in our lives might be. Well, Jonathan Lethem, thanks for talking to me.
Oh, you bet. It's great to be here.
Where are you zooming in from?
I am sitting in my house in Claremont, California, where I teach at Pomona College. I bounce around these days a lot between Maine and this town, which is on the eastern edge of Los Angeles. And I also live in the Catskills sometimes. The only thing I don't do is what people sort of expect I should be doing, which is like walking around the streets of Brooklyn all the time. I visit. I haven't lived there for about 15 years now.
It's the Brooklyn of the mind now. Well, this is a book, Cellophane Bricks, A Life in Visual Culture, that I guess the best way to describe it is a collection of your writings about art. Is that more or less in the region?
It is, yeah. That's the simple way to describe it. And then it's also a kind of a secret memoir about a part of my life, which is my relation to art and artists. It begins as a kind of a accidental compilation, like, wow, look, I've written all these different things about different artists and about painting over the years. And why do I keep doing this? What does it mean?
Okay, so you say it's a secret memoir. That is my cue to kick things off with my theory about the book, or a theory I have about the book. It starts and ends with your dad. You know, it starts in a house full of paintings and ends with a couple of texts about your dad. And the great theme of the book is the relationship of words to images or words to visual art. And your dad was a painter and you're known as a writer. So it seems to me some way the book is about your relationship to your dad through that lens. Is there anything in that?
Absolutely. I mean, the situation of my life as any kind of artist, just to use the word in the most general sense, begins with the house I grew up in, which was one that always held a painter's studio, and the painter was my father. And I was appropriately fascinated with my father and what he spent his time on and what he cared about and what his friends did and what they cared about from a time before I can remember. My early baby pictures are me sort of trying to get into his studio space or in there and holding a paintbrush and leaning against a wall.
Right, there's a text in here that's about that memory.
Exactly. So it's somatic. It's in my body, this feeling. What is it? What is this mystery? And then I very quickly became someone who wanted to make art too. And at first that took the most obvious form. I did draw and paint a lot as a kid. And eventually I went to art school as a teenager and at the very beginning of my college life. So I had this super intimate relationship to my father's practice, which was that I was trying to emulate it. I'd inherited a certain facility, like hand and eye coordination and gift for reproducing things and confidence in that ability. So I was easily impressive to adults. I could make little pictures that made them think I should be in art school and that I was like a little art prodigy. So I liked that. Any kid likes being praised and encouraged. It was just like almost an assumed mantle. Of course I'm going to be a painter too.
What was the art world like? Like you grew up in Brooklyn in a house full of artists. What was the New York art world like through your dad's lens?
It makes me laugh initially because, of course, it was his art world. And so it has to be absolutely made specific to the very particular way that he was relating to his ambition and his craft and his, whatever you'd call it, his avocation at that time. My parents were, by the time I was, awake and forming memories, they were dissidents. They were outsiders. They were leftists. They were sort of exiles from the world of proper grown-up professions and commerce. When I was youngest, and a couple of my earliest memories reference this, my father still had a conventional tenure-track teaching job at the Kansas City Art Institute, and he was doing all the right things. And he had, up to that point in the mid-'60s, done all the right things. He'd gotten a Fulbright and gone to Columbia and gotten a master's and was looking for opportunities to exhibit his work commercially. And he'd gone to Paris as a young man. Exactly what a painter of his generation ought to do, right? But the Vietnam War and their political leanings and their lifestyle threw them into another space by the time I was a kid in Brooklyn in the 70s. And my father was working as a carpenter. Didn't matter that he was a qualified professor. He didn't do that. He worked with his hands. And my parents were activists and protesters. And his art was exhibited in collective galleries, not commercial ones. And there were a number of these. There was one in particular on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn that I grew up inside the culture of this artist collective. The artists ran the space and took turns exhibiting their work. And it was even down to like they had a roster of who was going to go there and sit and cover the gallery hours to keep it open. And I even did some of those gallery hours at one point as a teenager.
Like working the desk, you mean?
Working the desk, yeah. I was really identified with this collective gallery and the idealism that suffused this enterprise. To me, that went with art, was a kind of anti-capitalist sentiment, anti-institutional desire. So the art world, as I knew it, was a combination of like going to Manhattan to look at art in museums and commercial galleries, but then also coming back to kind of our communal living and our communal gallery and his friend painters and his former students coming through the house and talking. And a lot of the art I looked at as a kid, beyond just my father's work, was stuff that people brought into the house to show him.
Right.
He was the kind of artist who was actively trading work with his friends, and people would come over with a portfolio stuff or a slideshow, and we would like have artists in effect kind of exhibiting their work in our space. And of course, the artwork he traded would be on our wall. So I grew up with a lot of really interesting work that wasn't just my dad's in the house.
You've already, I think, unlocked the entire book. I mean, for me, this relationship of your dad to art is like the key to this, what I consider a very interesting and kind of refreshing relationship to visual art that runs throughout all these texts in the book that I hope we can get into. In preparation for this interview, I was reading this sort of crazy oral history of your college years in Esquire. And there's a line you have in there where you talk about going to college as a kind of lower middle class kid and kind of realizing that world. And you say, I was projecting onto the school all the unfair privileges of the art world, rich people buying each other careers and all that. Really, it was my father's grudge that I took on as my own. And I thought that first line about rich people buying each other careers and seeing the professional art world that way was a really nice observation that deserves to be drawn out a little.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have to like always try to be fair, and wealthy people can make really great art too. Sure. There are like all sorts of wonderful counterexamples. I remember Robert Christgau has a line
the Village
about,
Voice music critic.
Yes, Village Voice music critic. He has a line about Carly Simon's "You're So Vain," which says, "This single is evidence that it is not impossible to have a trust fund and make a great rock and roll record. But it's funny, you know, I went to public school and I lived in Brooklyn. And as far as I knew, because our neighborhood was so chaotic and so culturally and economically and racially mixed, I mean, we had a house and a lot of stuff went on in it. And I felt very privileged in a lot of ways growing up. It took going off to where the rich people really hung out, to private college, for me to realize that I'd grown up poor. So it was a kind of a disenchantment that I was suffering at many psychic levels that I got initially very confused about. And then in the confusion was this kind of righteous anger against recognizing that secret handshakes and the exchange of, you know, kind of ratifying each other's, you know, well-assembled art collections, and that a lot of art was made important or made visible because of essentially privilege and its extension and its investments in careers. And suddenly I realized, oh, my dad's like not famous for a reason. Even though he's painting so seriously for such a long time. You know, I mean, there's lots of people who don't get famous who are painting seriously, but I started to just see the system and it left me bitter. So I took that information in and used it in various ways to adjust my worldview and orient myself once I wasn't living in this sort of bohemian dream that my parents had fostered for me.
Well, if your father's mode of art making is sort of one model of that, I mean, I guess the other model is your peers. In the introduction to one of the sections of this book, you write, if the grown-ups on my scene were painters, then my friends and my brother's friends were cartoonists and graffiti writers. This, of course, is the subject of a lot of your fiction. And your brother is quite a famous street artist, correct?
He is, and very active now. He's showing a lot. He's like kind of had a renaissance in actually making work recently. And so he's super visible on Instagram and in a couple of galleries that are representing the stuff. Yeah, he's famous. You have to specify this in a couple of different overlapping registers. One is he's a living historical embodiment of the birth of hip-hop and street art. He's a living witness and participant to a time that has now become sort of a legend and a fascination. And of course, the death toll is awfully high for those participants. So those like my brother who are fortunate enough to still be walking the earth and can say what it was like, their oral historical witnessing becomes really compelling to people. What it was like to go to the train yards and do a bombing run in 1975 or something. You know, it's crazy that to put it in a vernacular, he goes out to dinner on those accounts frequently. But he's also making work now, and he's making work that is vibrantly interrogating that legacy. And it's not graffiti, he would be the first to say, in the strict sense that it's not done under cover of night, it's not illegal, it's not on a train. It's something else. It's graffiti art, there's graffiti-influenced art. But he's right in that mix. And he also designed some very famous album covers in the rap world. And most mysteriously and mythically, he was the designer of MF Doom's mask.
Wow. Which
is like a talismanic object. I mean, you see it like as a bumper sticker now. And
sure,
I'm like, oh yeah, there it is again.
That's amazing.
It's crazy, yeah.
Well, look, I mean, you're kind of famous as a writer, as a genre bender, or someone who's interested in genre. This book is about, well, you confess an interest in images that become words and words that become images. And I think something you reflect on in the book is that graffiti artists didn't call themselves artists, they call themselves writers, because you're putting up names and words. It's an example of that sort of in the wild or organic example of that kind of like genre play.
That intermingling of mediums and genres and forms. One of the things that I think I was writing about in the Fortress of Solitude, but it was a discovery, was that comic book art, vernacular, advertising art, commercial signage, bubblegum wrappers, and film, animated film, these things all drew so energetically from both the verbal and the visual sphere. And this area of confusion and overlay, New York was where advertising was invented, right? At Madison Avenue, the signage, Times Square, the graffiti, torn subway advertisements layered and became surrealist collage artworks, the accidental artworks of destroyed advertising overlaid by graffiti writers this kind of verbal, visual chaos was our surround. It was the space we grew up inside.
I mean, I know this is a cliche, but I guess in a lot of your writing, the city is a character. Like in some of these little short stories that you write for artists in here, it is almost like what you were just describing. These sort of shape-shifting landscapes maybe comes from that experience of the city.
Yeah, for sure.
As a canvas.
I mean, I write a lot about feral children, too, because I think the city at that time, to go back to talk about me and my brother, but also to encompass some of the artists like Todd James and Gregory Crewdson and Katie Mers. There's a handful of people who are written about in this book who actually are sort of my contemporaries in that experience of New York City in the 70s and what it was like to grow up inside that space. Now, there are lots of other artists included in the book who come from other places, who grew up elsewhere or are different generations from mine. But I think there's a motif running through some of the pieces that you're thinking about where I'm really identifying that our brain waves are matched, or our nervous systems are attuned in some way because of this simultaneity of experience of growing up in the kind of distressed, glorious, flamboyantly ruined New York City of the 70s and 80s.
So I want to get into those texts, but before I do, I just want to talk about you as an artist. What kind of art did you make? It sounds like you made all kinds of art and then gave it all up.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to reminisce about it. I started out drawing more than painting, partly because it's just easier for a kid to be handed a pencil and a pad or a nice set of magic markers. And I grew up in like the first grade era of a long metal box full of different colored magic markers. That was pretty exciting. So even when I worked in color initially, it was often felt-tipped markers. You know, I remember how gushy they'd be initially, and then they'd get dry and almost crispy as you tried to get the last of the color out of them. And I started painting too, because the materials were in the house. So I was doing wall art, and I was often doing something kind of representational, partly because, as I said, I'd inherited a facility. I could work from life, and people would be like, oh, that looks like, you made that cat look like a cat. That was cool to be able to do it. I was interested in abstract art, but I was more interested in surrealism, I think, where I could fuse my imaginative, fantastical, or psychedelic interior visionary stuff with this trick of reproducing reality, doing something mimetic at the same time. And I think the key to what carried over from my life as a visual artist to my writing life is really caught in that description. I liked surrealism. I liked it more than my dad liked it. He had a book of Max Ernst's pictures in his library of art books, and I was really into that. And then I wanted to look at some other artists that he didn't seem interested in, like Magritte, and he didn't think Magritte was that painterly. That illusionistic thing was very interesting to me. Even like M.C. Escher, there was a paperback that I bought at some point of M.C. Escher drawings. Now, this was not my dad's idea of visual art, but I was really turned on by the combination of highly rendered reproductions of mimetic things in the service of surreal visions or paradoxical or conceptual visions.
There's a painting reproduced in here, which it looks like a Giorgio de Chirico painting, but it's of Brooklyn, yeah?
That's a trick. That's my dad's. That's a painting he made at Columbia, but that was probably a picture that, in a way, pointed me more directly to the kind of art I was wishing I would make.
Yeah, it is kind of surreal Brooklyn.
Absolutely. Had appropriation in it and had reference in it. I was very much a child also of the post-pop era, which is like I looked at Rauschenberg's and I looked at Lichtenstein's, and I was like, oh yeah, you put stuff from the world into the canvas. You put advertising images, Jasper Johns. My dad's generation was a little more centered on abstract expressionism, even though he was doing figurative work.
All that stuff was the bad object for them.
Yeah. I was a combination of his interest in painterliness and my interest in vernacular and pop imagery, film, comic books. So when he made that De Chirico appropriation, which was actually done, I think, as an assignment for one of his professors at Columbia, he was told to pick a painter and do an emulation, but make it your own. On that day, or whenever it was, however long it took him that he made that painting, he happened to be working in a vein that really turned me on, but wasn't what really turned him on. And so my work, when I made it, in college, when I was painting the most seriously for a little while, it did have a lot of imagery that was appropriated, and language would be directly painted on the canvas. It was somewhere in the kind of a sweet spot, if it was sweet at all. I mean, I was a very apprentice painter. I wasn't that accomplished, but I was sort of triangulating between pop art appropriations of vernacular imagery and surrealist impulses.
So you go off to Bennington College in Vermont at this now closely scrutinized, interesting time in literary history of Bennington with Donna Tartt and Bret Easton Ellis and a bunch of other people. In this book, you talk about going there thinking you're a painter and your teachers basically saying, you say they saw through the bullshit. These paintings had words in them. They wanted to be texts.
Yeah, well, it wasn't exactly that they assigned me, you've got to stop painting and start writing. When I say they saw through my bullshit, it was more like they saw that I was coasting on my facility and this assumed relation. You know, all through high school, I had really been kind of at the top of my class in the painting high school I went to. Because I'd grown up in my dad's world and I'd looked at so much work with him and thought about it so much and practiced more than most 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, I took it for granted that I was one of the best young painters. I got to Bennington and that, you know, like a lot of things that happen to you at college where you're humbled because a lot of other people have got a lot of stuff going on, not even to begin to speak of what was happening in the writing program, right? I was like, oh, I'm not knocking them dead anymore just because I know how to do some underpainting or I can do a likeness. They saw that I was sort of fooling around. It was more like I just was caught out in my lack of deep-rooted commitment to painting as an expressive exploration. I was doing it because I was good at it instead. And in fact, I was already at that point, at another layer, more committed, much more deeply anchored to a desire to tell stories. I'd hit a limit with painting because it was in other kinds of expressive arts, like film and comic books, and especially the novel, that I was really finding my own, I was being pulled into my own deeper purpose, if that makes any sense. I was painting to continue to receive the strokes as an art kid star. I was like, that's fun. But meanwhile, I was really thinking, if I'm going to say anything that I want to say, I think I have to use time and narrative and language to do it. Like, that's where the action really was for me.
Yeah, so long story short, you drop out of college and become a famous novelist. And
well,
then
yeah. There's some time in between those two actions.
Then there's some time in between that, and a lot of other stuff happens. And then, in a way, come back to art through the reversed form. These texts, which a lot of which are writing texts about art for catalogs. So the catalog essay is a funny little thing. I guess this is where I kind of wanted to go with you as a writer, because catalog tests are just a very strange artifact in the art world that exist, and people serve this very specific promotional function. People don't really think about them, how strange they are. But they are strange, and I just wonder what you think about the form. And it's a promotional form, so it also relates in my head to, like, all this stuff we were talking about your father, about how, you know, it's an artifact of the commercial art world.
I have a lot of thoughts about this. So, I mean, they've developed. They were instincts. I couldn't have articulated them until relatively recently. I was more focused on, like, how did I end up writing these texts? And then as I began to discuss them and describe them and put the book together, I was like, why are they like they are? Why are they not like catalog texts?
Because to be clear, there's a lot of stuff in this book, but a large section of it are essentially fables or short stories.
They're fictions about the creators of the artworks.
Yeah.
The majority of the artists that I'm invited to write about, I don't treat it as an opportunity to write an essay or a critical piece, let alone a catalog essay, as it's conventionally understood. I take it as an invitation to write a kind of prose poem or fiction about my experience or my fantasies about this artist and their works. You know, why did I do that? Well, there's a lot of explanations, and this is worth going into in detail, because with you, I know I'm in a space where I can really unpack some of the particulars.
Let's unpack.
Right, so I'm going to pick up your story where you leave it, right? I go away from art and I go to writing. Well, that's true. But what I didn't go away from was hanging out with artists, because I still felt comfortable in people's studios. I made a lot of artist friends at college before I dropped out, And I continued to know them and hang out with them in my 20s. And I also gravitated towards artists. I fell in love with painters. I hung out with painters and sculptors. And almost inescapably, at some point when you're doing this and you're a writer, artists need texts around their works at times.
Yeah.
So the question began to be asked, would you write something? But what's important to note here is that the book is, therefore, in some sense, a document of a social practice, which is that I was a writer who was still kind of a wannabe artist. Even though I'd thrown it over, I was also pining for that atmosphere and that feeling that being in artist studios and thinking with them about their work gave me. So it was also a kind of connecting to a lost part of myself. And so the invitations to write about their work come about because of this very particular personality formation, right? The dog who wants to be with the cats or whatever I was. So then the invitations come, and my first response, which was again on instinct, was, well, I don't think I can write you an essay because I don't really know how to do art writing and I don't really read it a lot because I mostly don't dig it, but I'll write you a story. And the artists, you know, as it happens, without exception, catching the scent of what I was up to and saying, yeah, do that. Sounds good. You know, no one ever said to me, oh, I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted. Everyone was always sort of like, well, I'd like to see what you mean. So I started writing these stories about my encounters with artists, some of them close friends, some of them people that I was just getting to know because of the invitation. But I would always, in a way, want to involve myself with a studio visitation or two and conversation so that I could kind of do this weird ventriloquism where I would write a short story that was sort of a fantasy about how that artist saw the world.
Yeah.
And as you point out, that becomes the body of this book. There are some other kinds of writings in there, but those are the preponderance of the pieces of writing that emerged from this transaction that I just described.
It seems to me that it's your way of doing it wrong, that, you know, in a lot of your fiction, I don't know, you have a problem with narrative authority, you know, that, that like the narration goes wrong. Like there's clearly some kind of like need, like to throw things off. And then in this case, I guess the way I was reading it, and just tell me if this is off, is that, yeah, there's this relationship to the art world, goes back to your dad's relation to the art world, which is that to a certain extent, the professional art world has all kinds of sense of compromise within it, but you love artists, and this is your way to do the professional obligation of the catalog essay, but do it in a way that preserves that feeling of mutuality and gift giving from the collective art world that you grew up most connected to.
I like the way you put it, and I want to completely agree. But I wouldn't even talk about it as fulfill a professional obligation, because a lot of these were written in sort of vagabond or outre ways that wasn't sort of like, oh my God, my gallerist needs there to be a major text. A couple of times, you know, like when I wrote about Gregory Kudzin's work to form a text for this giant coffee table book that Aperture, or I can't remember what imprint it was, you know, that was like a professional responsibility. His big career retrospective coffee table book needs a text, and I'm going to write one. But much of the time it was kind of more fugitive. It was like a form of play. There wasn't a lot of pressure, and there weren't a lot of people bearing down on this, being like, well, why isn't this like the kind of essay that we normally expect? It was just sort of like everybody got excited that I wanted to do something from left field, and there was never any resistance or a comparison to the, you know, the norm.
Oh, and I think I can hear people thinking, listening to this, well, it's work for hire, right? So isn't this just like a little bit of like money on the side? But another part of this for you is that you insist on only working in trade, in-kind work.
You could look at it very cynically, because I did end up with some awfully nice art, most of it tiny
Sure,
art.
you say you probably made out like a bandit.
I made out like a bandit, but yes, it was important and felt good to reproduce the condition of my father trading paintings for paintings and say, yeah, you know, give me even if it's just a little sketch or a tiny little study, doesn't have to be major. I don't have that big a house anyway. I don't want money for this. Just figure out some object to give me instead. You know, you would think that I'd get pushback. I think artists really love when the money gets taken out of the mix. I mean, we all need to make a living in this world, but people were immediately responsive to that. And so I have, yes, as a result of all this writing, accumulated a lot of really cool objects. You know, actually more than I can hang now. So I've begun finding ways to give some of them back out into the world. That's been awesome.
look, it's a Jonathan Lethem short story you're getting out of this. The name of the collection is Cellophane Bricks. The point of a catalog text, I think, in general, is like, ideally, artists want to be written into art history, which means the catalog text is serving as research purposes that allows other artists or people to write about it in a way that writes them into art history and eventually inspire more art. So it's just taking that out of there, and it's just another artwork directly inspired by that.
Yeah, I have no function in art history. So, but let me talk about, because this is, a rare conversation where we can really, really nail some of this. Why didn't I have a model for art critical writing that I liked? Because I do write criticism. I write about film and I write about music pretty frequently. And I have critics that are really influential on my writing. I already mentioned Chris Gow in passing, right?
Oh, yeah, and you write about Manny Farber, who's a great film critic here.
I read as a teenager when I was developing my desire, my appetite to work with language. I read some of these people with total awe. And, there were times when I thought, I want to be Andrew Sarris or Greil Marcus. There was an energy in certain critical voices, Ellen Willis, Lester Bangs, Manny Farber for sure, where I was like as lit up as I was by fiction. And when I eventually wrote critically, I had models that I liked and I was excited by, but I didn't ever latch on to anyone like that who was writing about visual art. Now,
Right.
I have kind of like an analysis for that in part.
Oh, great. Why is art writing so bad?
You've already kind of touched on it. It's because it's not written to express or describe for the potential wide audience. It's written for the collector, the curator, and for art history. I'm saying such a sweeping thing. Of course, there are fascinating. Later, I actually did become really excited by Peter Sheljahl. But I didn't have this body of this conversation. The way in film criticism or music criticism, there was this sense of a universe, a constellation of people. The early rock critics fascinated me. Paul Williams and Paul Nelson and Richard Meltzer and Greil Marcus. The invention of the language for describing these values was so rich for me. And I started to realize, I like critical writing that has a chip on its shoulder because someone else has devalued the object and said it's ephemeral or worthless. I like film criticism, but especially mid-century film criticism when it's all fundamentally making an argument that film is an art. And I like early rock and roll criticism, the writers of the 60s, because they're inventing a language for saying, hey, pop music isn't disposable. It actually could be a vehicle for greatness. And that defiance, that edge of proving something against a bias, against this work, that's what excited me most in those critics. Well, fine art doesn't have that.
You're saying art is too valuable to have interesting writing about it.
It's too canonical for it to be written about critically in that way that was particularly thrilling for me, which was this sort of like, you don't get it. I got to tell you, this stuff is real. This stuff is good. Instead, it's written to enshrine and position the work inside a space of established values.
That's so interesting because it's the reverse of this thought I've been having. It seems to me there are a lot of writers interested in art right now. And I was kind of toying with why, and I just wondered suddenly, is it because we're moving towards a post-literate world? And Chris Kraus has this sort of, I think of it as the lint trap theory of visual art, which is that like, as other things become devalued, art just kind of acquires them. It becomes art as it moves out of other spaces. And so I was thinking, is that what's happening? Is just like people look to art because it's like the last place where there's a market for things. And because of conceptual art, anything can be art. So like dance gets thrown into the mix and, even, certain forms of like activism get thrown into the mix because they're otherwise devalued. And I was wondering, is that what's happening with what I see as a vogue for interest in visual art right now?
I think that's great. I mean, it's really interesting because, but isn't the market also collapsing at the same time? Sometimes it's at the moment
crisis, they
of
call
catastrophe or the vacating of commerce from a zone that it becomes its truest self, even if it's imperiled or at some level, the money's gone elsewhere, then it belongs to the fans. It's like maybe visual art is ready finally to have like a fan-driven culture, the way, a lot of things that I'm really into, like rock and roll and science fiction. What if the fans were in charge? But I want to just take one further step, which circles right back to the very title of the book, which is, I'm going to extend Chris Krause's thought and your thought and say, I think that one of the things that interests me most is in this era of virtuality and a kind of mediation and digitization, there is always a kind of an opposite tidal movement towards the involvement with the physicality of the analog unique artifact, the return of vinyl. I go to Instagram and what do I look at? I look at used books, people celebrating these objects. Even as you can like completely get any text you want from the genie in the bottle, people are thinking about old dust jackets and cloth bindings. And I think this intersection where the art object meets the physical artifact, the book is itself an art object, even when it's mass produced, it still has that fineness, that peculiarity, that weird, smelly, body-like quality to it. It can degenerate the way a body or a painting can. And this place is of vital interest to me. It's a bit mysterious, but I tried to capture this appetite for the book as art object in my book about art.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was going to ask you about vinyl because you write about artwork that incorporates vinyl in the book. And also because we had Thurston Moore on a couple episodes ago, and we were talking about record art and how that was this entry point into the culture of music, like these objects that you kind of lose in the digital realm. And I was getting some of the same vibe from this book. Yeah, you talked about books as objects and trying to connect with words as objects, and even some of the design of your books, like your first book having this really distinctive design that made it kind of a sculpture. I wanted to ask you about collecting art because, and I think it relates to something you just said about maybe a more hopeful kind of relationship of people to art that sometimes feels very over-professionalized and like everyone's performing a profession that doesn't exist, essentially. I mean, I guess I find a lot of this book is about art that you live with, and you have a really distinctive relationship to art that's like very loving. It's a collection of art that you talk about that some of it's by people I know, some of it's by people I don't know, that you just have a very personal relationship with. And I found it very refreshing. I was like, this is such a more accessible way to think about living with art. It's maybe closer to the way that ordinary people live with it than the normal way that, a professional art magazine talks about it. So maybe just talk about how you live with art and your theory of collecting.
I love that description that you've offered, and it really consoles me to think that that energy transmits out of the book. Again, this circles right back to the very start. Growing up in a house where, I took it for granted that there would be paintings on the walls, not posters of things, not reproductions, but unique objects, mostly my dad's work and his pals. And I think that I just felt that it was a form of living in a sense with other bodies, and that I created a hunger to live with these fragments of life, these objects that were made. And so, I didn't like empty walls and I didn't like posters. When I left home, I took a lot of my dad's smaller works, like that De Chirico has traveled with me. I even, God help me, I took it to my dorm room in college. It's amazing it survived. And then I began wanting to walk away with at least a drawing that I could frame or a collage from some of my friends who were making things, some of them not even people who declared themselves artists. I mean, one of the things I tried to do in this book is throw together things that I've declared are art, objects that I've lived with as art objects with things that were intentionally made for exhibition. And it's a form of intimacy, I guess, to live with something that, I'm going to use this word again, like kind of stinks of the hours of someone's hand and attention on them. And I don't feel at home without that kind of stink around me.
Well, okay, I think that, I think you've got more books to write and more art to write about, so I feel like I should let you go. But I really enjoyed trying to figure out your way of thinking about art. I got a great deal out of it.
That's
so
dynamite.
Thank you for being
here. It's a great
here.
talk. Really a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review The Art Angle. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Caroline Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.